Tonight, new questions about the American airstrike that killed 22 people in an Afghan hospital. The story, it keeps changing, but the facts are, well, frankly, horrifying and also very telling. Then, Russia is rushing ground troops into Syria, that on top of the airstrikes and the questionable targets that they are hitting. We've got our top military expert here to talk about both Syria and Afghanistan. Also, gun control becoming a big issue in the presidential campaign. But the question is, which side will have the winning message? We'll debate that with our political panel. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we start this evening with the U.S. airstrike that killed 22 people at a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan this past Saturday. Here is what the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan had to say about it at a Senate hearing earlier this morning.
Afghan forces on the ground requested aerial support from our forces that are on the ground. But as I said in my opening statement, even though the Afghans request that support, it still has to go through a rigorous U.S. procedure to enable fires to go on the ground.
But there was no forward air controllers, American forward air controllers on the ground.
So we had a special operations unit that was in close vicinity that was talking to the aircraft to deliver those fires.
General Campbell, who you just heard from, went on to say that the airstrike was a mistake and the U.S. never targets hospitals. Doctors Without Borders not satisfied with any of those answers. It issued the following statement, quote, "Today, the U.S. government has admitted that it was their airstrike that hit our hospital. Their description of the attack keeps changing from collateral damage to a tragic incident to now attempting to pass responsibility to the Afghanistan government." All right, let's bring in our panel to talk about this. Mike Lyons, frequent guest, a military analyst, also retired captain in the U.S. Army who served in Iraq. Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent, and Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Okay, Mike, first off, I always give this disclaimer. It's easy to say this on a Tuesday afternoon in a climate-controlled studio. But that said, just to put a sheen on this, AC-130s that were used for this are supposed to be precision, striking aircraft. This wasn't some remote drone that was sent out from thousands of miles away here. And this went on for 30 minutes. Can you explain how such a huge mistake was made when we already apparently were given coordinates that this was a hospital long before the day of the attacks?
Yeah, first and foremost, the AC-130 is a slow-moving, propeller-driven aircraft that circles the target with two large guns that fire out both sides of it. And in this particular case, it wasn't one bomb that was dropped. It wasn't a fire-forget bomb. It was a continuous round of fire. And you saw General Campbell say that they had special forces in the area, but the linchpin was they didn't have really eyes on the target. They didn't have a ground air controller to make sure that they were getting any feedback from this. So
help the layperson out, though, Mike, if you could. A call comes in from our Afghanistan troops on the ground saying we're under attack.
Right.
What is the checks and balances? What's the protocol that goes on before we fire the first guns into what turned out to be a hospital, but to any building?
Yeah, that's the key question, Rich, because it's multiple things that happen, some at the same time, but mostly in sequence. The first thing is it a good target? Who is out there watching it? Does it meet the rules of engagement? In some cases, that target gets passed by a lawyer that's in the TOC, the Tactical Command Center, on whether he believes that or she believes that's a good target or not. So there's anywhere from 20 to 25 checks that have to take place. And in this particular situation, all it would have taken was one thing to stop that from being fired, and you wouldn't have the situation on the ground.
Stupid question for me. Somebody gives the coordinates of where they want it. Don't they match it up to say, time out? These are the same coordinates we have for a hospital.
Well, I think that whether that's the case or not, I think that'll come out in the investigation. It depends on where those coordinates were. You've got multiple sorties that are taking place at the same time, hundreds of missions and thousands of missions that have been fought. So from a statistical perspective, you have to expect, we've talked about before, commanders expect losses. And in this case, again, there was just not that last check and balance to figure out that that actually was a hospital. Had there been someone watching that on the ground, saw a Red Cross or something, they could have called check fire, it would have stopped. But when you have that AC-130 circling like it did going on for a half hour, it just wasn't going to happen.
But my question is, when it's circling for half an hour, it's a hospital, right? Wouldn't you have thought after the first few minutes to say, time out here, this isn't
It's 2 o'clock in the morning. They didn't have the kind of optics at the point. You know, I'm sure everybody's well rested there, but on the ground. You also have an issue that's going to come out that maybe people don't want to talk about, but it's possible that the Afghan military calls in that target and they pass it that it's okay that it's a hospital, because from their perspective, they're getting ground fire from Al-Qaeda or whoever, Taliban, whoever was inside that building. So they have different rules of engagement. That's possible that's going to come out. Now, for us to say that, I think is not going to be too politically correct, but that's another thing that could happen.
We hear this expression, and again, easy for guys like me in suits to say here, fog of war. But do we have a clear line in the military, Mike, as to what is acceptable mistakes that can happen versus what is, this was a failure, not just of communication, but there has to be accountability for this. And what should that accountability be?
Well, the accountability is going to be in the process. And at this point, the rule of engagement that's going to change is that eyes on the target is going to have to come into play. And they're going to have ground air controllers there. They're going to be more in harm's way. But that was the issue. If they had someone there watching this target on the ground, even if they were with the Afghan military, wherever they were, you wouldn't have had the situation. The problem, too, is Kunduz is an area that the Afghan government thought was safe. Everybody thought was secure. They have not flown missions over there in years. So they weren't familiar with the people. They weren't familiar with the buildings. You couple that into it. You couple all those things, the 25 things to the checklist,
Yep.
and it looks clear, and then all of a sudden you get the situation.
Last question for me. I know these guys want to jump in, but you're now one of these 22 families, okay, including doctors, right, who are going over there. And they say, fine, snafu, miscommunication. My husband, my son, my daughter, my whatever is still dead tonight here. Where's the accountability? Who's paying the price? What is that answer? And should it be? Should somebody in the military be out of work? Should somebody have to resign? Should somebody go to a brig? Like, where does the line start and stop? Should it, Mike? This isn't rhetorical. What should it be when something like this happens where it's such a tragic mistake?
Unlike, we were taught at West Point, for example, if you were unsure of whether a target was legal or illegal or not, if you were a helicopter driver, for example, you were a pilot, if you had to land your helicopter to make sure that that was an enemy target, you landed your helicopter. You can't blame the pilots on this situation. You have to look at the process. Somebody did give permission, so to speak, on whether or not to clear that or not. So that's where you're going to go. The United States will write a very big check to all those individuals.
So, Mike, what about the possibility? There were reports that terrorists might have been at the facility.
Right.
Is that dismissed at this point?
No, that's the thing, Dominic. If they were there and the Afghan government is firing, that might have been the linchpin as to why the Afghan government says, we don't care that it's a hospital. I mean, they have different values than we have with regard to the situation. They might have known it was a hospital. That didn't get passed through. That got forgotten in the fog of war. So that's the point. If we come to find that that's the case, then that extra check balance has got to get back into this process.
You mentioned the thousands of sorties that we've flown in Afghanistan. Combine that with Iraq and all of the other missions, drone strikes. How often is it that we fire on a target without those eyes on the ground that you're talking about, so we can get a sense of what our success rate really is when we're firing blind, so to speak?
Not often. I think General Campbell brought that up today about how we've not resourced the Afghan theater. And it really, from the very beginning, you go back 13 years, it's part of the problem of, from the very beginning, we focused on Iraq and we took all our resources, we put them there. In most cases, you'd have a drone, you'd have some other pair of eyes on that target. We just don't have the resources, and we're not willing to put them in harm's way. This president is just not willing to put a U.S. soldier in a very dangerous spot in order to put eyes on that target, in order to evaluate what the damage is going to be.
But isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, well, you're going to then we have to accept the kind of loss, we have to accept the kind of statistical analysis that took place with this hospital.
First, they called it collateral damage. Just bad choice of words, or is it kind of a little bit of a reality check as how these things are looked at when we don't have the ground resources, when this is a volatile theater that we're present but we're not really fully committed to? Was that a slip or was it telling?
Probably a PR slip. Collateral damage is a military term on some level, and it's at 50,000 feet. It's the same thing as a commander coming out on his deck on an aircraft carrier. One of his pilots crashed on the carrier, was killed. Collateral damage. Get that off. We got to land more planes here. It is this capability to compartmentalize and move forward with the mission when the time comes. The military has got to deal with it. It's what it does. It's part of your DNA.
But
when
from a
you're
messaging standpoint, if
Yeah.
you were in that hospital that day, you don't want to hear your loved one was collateral
messaging
damage.
is wrong, right, Rich?
Finally, our producer mentioned this. We were talking this afternoon about this. I bet you there were a lot of people at home in the last 24 hours who said, wow, we're still in Afghanistan? I think there's a perception among a lot of people, and I think the military may even be surprised at this, that the American public thinks we're gone out of Afghanistan. We don't really have a role. Is it that half-pregnant, 1 foot in, just toe in the water thing that's making this from difficult to near impossible?
I think so. I know General Campbell personally, actually. I could tell you a little inside baseball story about him. He volunteered to go and do that job. He was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He could have had that job and then retired and done something else. But he volunteered to take that job because he recognized it needed a strong leader that's there. And like now, you see him standing up and being the one speaking to it. And he's going to now tell the president, we're going to have to leave more troops here. If we leave completely, which is what this president wants. This president wants to end wars, right? We all know that he wants to end Afghanistan, end Iraq, and when his administration is over, doesn't want a single soldier there. Again, hard from a military perspective to see what will happen if you look over the horizon. This is the kind of thing that'll happen if we don't still have Americans there.
All right. Hardly the only international issue concerning not only our military but also American interests. Coming up next, Russia bombing more, moving more troops into Syria. We're going to ask Mike what our options are to deal with it and whether we should get more involved or stay out.